based on my experience of working with arts, cultural and live event organizations around the world. Like everyone, I'm not keen on talking about myself, but I think it's useful that you have a sense of my background and where I'm coming from with this webinar. I'm James. That's a pre-lockdown photo of me from when we were able to do things like outside. I'm managing director at Made Media. We're a digital agency and we make websites and digital products for arts and cultural organizations around the world, like some of these fantastic ones. I'm also a trustee at Stage Text, which is a charity here in the UK providing advice and support services to make arts and cultural events accessible for deaf, deafened and hard of hearing people. They've been incredibly busy since lockdown began in the UK, supporting the captioning of lots of online content that's been made available over the last couple of months. I'm also chair of a small London-based theatre company called Potential Difference, which unfortunately has had to postpone its latest production due to the coronavirus shutdown. I used to work at The Place in London, the UK Centre for Contemporary Dance, and for the ticketing provider Spectrix. So all of this probably shows I'm fairly biased towards the arts and cultural sector, which is where most of my experience has been, although I think most, if not all, of what I'm going to say today is relevant for any kind of ticketed or events business. So today I want to do three things. I want to talk a little bit about the current context and what I think this means for the way that organizations should be approaching their digital strategy. I'm going to introduce some pillars of digital investment and talk about who I think should be making these decisions and the kinds of things they should be thinking about when they do. And then I'm going to try and tie it together and hope it makes some sort of sense. So the world's changed now beyond all recognition since even the beginning of March, when we were all happily gathered in darkened rooms and stadia for the shared experience of live events. And with the world totally shut down by a virus that makes those kinds of gatherings impossible, the question on many people's lips is whether everything has changed forever. I actually don't think it has. I think over time, human behavior will return to some sort of pre-COVID normality. But that doesn't mean I'm optimistic. And by now, I think there are three truths that will probably feel quite obvious to all of you, but should be informing our strategic planning. The first one is that businesses that are reliant on gathering people together are going to be the last to reopen and the least able to pivot to other revenue streams. I'd actually argue events businesses are even worse off than hospitality and tourism because of the lead-in time required to open up, needing to schedule events and book performers, etc. There's going to be some period of limited operation that is going to have a huge commercial impact on the sector. And we're just starting to get a sense of how big that impact is going to be. And alongside all of this, the bigger impact on the world economy is going to massively hit consumer confidence and spending power. I'm finding it helpful to think of our current situation in three distinct phases. We're in lockdown at the moment, and until such time we're told by public authorities that we're not anymore. Then there's going to be a period of social distancing, which will have profound effects on where and how much we sell. For the live performance sector, it's hard to find a social distancing model that suggests more than a third of regular demand can be met. Some events-related businesses will decide that they simply can't operate under these circumstances, but the longer this phase goes on, I think the more likely it is that some attempt will be made to reopen under these rules. The point is, we're only going to move into the third phase and some sort of recovery when some point of societal adaptation has been reached, whether that's a vaccine or effective treatment or kind of mass immunity among the population. And it will happen, but none of us have any idea when it will happen, and that could take years. And of course, I told you I wasn't optimistic. We could go back into a lockdown phase if there's a second wave of the virus in our area. But it's only once we hit that point of adaptation that a real recovery is going to begin. And the speed of that recovery is dependent on both consumer confidence and spending power, neither of which we have any idea about yet, but which will both be affected by a sort of almost certain recessionary period. So top of everyone's mind is, how will your business change over the coming months and years? And gallons of digital ink are going to be spilt answering these questions over the next months. And I don't want to get too far into operational questions, but I do want to take each of these phases in turn and just talk about some of the ideas and how they sort of edge up against the things we're thinking of in terms of digital strategy. I don't want to talk too much about the lockdown phase because I think it's a stressful enough time without people like me going on about how it can be a great opportunity for digital. The world is on hold because that's what we've been told to do. And for a great majority of people, the focus is on family, health, and livelihoods. As a result of the crisis, we're reacting to events rather than proactively investing in new strategies. And I actually think the best reason to not do anything during this phase is that for most organizations, cash preservation is the most important objective, because that will mean we can more strategically invest when we get to the second and third phases of this crisis. And because we don't know how long the lockdown phase will last, we can't decide when to come out of this cash preservation mode. Finally, to reiterate the point about the world being on hold, I'd ask the question, are you 100% sure that your audience and customers need you right now when their focus is in a totally different place? There are two kind of big caveats to this. One is around customer service, refunds and cancellations, where your audience and customers absolutely need you to step up. And the other is where you have some asset or skills that you can easily deploy to support your community. Maybe that's a back catalogue of digital performances you can make readily available online, or maybe that's opening up your costume department to create face masks. I would say when you're in this phase of the crisis, digital technology is going to fill the cracks like water. You won't necessarily be able to control it, and I actually think that's okay. If you're able to take a strategic approach, that's fantastic. But if that's eluding you because of everything else that's going on, my advice would be to focus on what you're planning on doing in the next phase when some activity is allowed. When live performance and events venues are finally allowed to start operating, everyone's going to have a very different approach to the way that they operate. And actually, I think some just won't be able to. If businesses feel like they can open up, they're going to seem very different to the customer. Likely with staggered entry into the venue to avoid crowds just before showtime. There's probably going to be many fewer bars and restaurants, possibly no intervals or intermissions in plays and concerts. Maybe the service will be provided at the seat instead. Maybe we'll see social distancing seating. Maybe people will wear masks. Maybe we'll give up on reserved seating for a while in order to seat people safely. As a result of that, I think fewer seats available might lead to more performances, and more varied start and end times to avoid pressures on public transport and to fit in with varied working hours. We're probably going to need to know more about the people who are attending in order to follow up with them and comply with test and trace guidelines. And maybe, hopefully, we'll see much easier mechanisms for people to exchange and get refunds or credits on their tickets. Finally, I think we'll see much greater use of digital distribution, not just as archival footage, but to complement live performances like pay-per-view sports or limited release digital recordings available for a set period after live performances are finished, or more innovatively filmed performances like we're all hoping this Hamilton movie will be. Having a considered digital strategy and a considered approach to digital investment will help us deal with many of these new ways of working. Digital technology allows us to communicate and coordinate from a distance, whether that's for remote ordering of intermission drinks or virtual queuing outside of a venue, or coordination of event and start and end times across a busy entertainment district like the West End or Broadway. Before I move on, I do want to say a bit more about two of these things that seem to be getting a lot of attention at the moment. The first is socially distanced seating. I don't have a magic wand, and I don't think there is a technological magic wand that will square the circle of revenue requirements and the physical distance that will be required to maintain between each other. But I would say these things, it's definitely going to happen for some venues for some time to begin with, because I think venues, insurers, and public authorities are all going to be cautious and naturally averse to taking more risk than they need to. I'd also say that all of those entities, particularly venues, are going to require smaller capacities to test out the other measures that they're going to have to put in place. That means that for some venues just won't open initially because they can't make it work. But over time, some best practices will evolve, and this will help more venues open up. Some lack of capacity might be made up by changes in format, such as more frequent, shorter event times with fewer intermissions. But in conversations I've had with venues so far, the biggest challenge is actually they feel like the biggest challenge is going to be in controlling the entry and the exit from the venue, because it might not matter if everyone is 2 meters apart once they're sat down, if they're worried about having to take part in a rugby scrum to actually get to their seat. This is why I think, at least initially, many venues will opt for unreserved or general admission seating in zones across a venue, meaning that the seating can happen kind of based on when you arrive and happen on a sort of an inside-out basis, leaving appropriate gaps. Some of these problems can be solved with technology, but I think it's going to be a matter of seeing how the operational requirements work out before we put a technological solution on them. I'm also aware of the irony of spending years as an industry working out how to avoid single seats being left across an auditorium, and now working out how to mandate them. The other thing I want to talk about in a little bit more detail is digital distribution and streaming, which is something I've had lots of conversations about over the last couple of months. The first thing I want to say is it's hard to see how the economics stack up. And I think some organizations are going to have success some of the time, but there's too much competition and the offer isn't compelling enough to get the volume of sales you need to replace live event income. I've seen some fairly naive statements on social media, I think mostly from people who are outside of the sector, claiming that this is a great opportunity to pivot to some model of digital distribution. That said, some model of digital distribution will absolutely be used to supplement live event revenues. I'd actually say this is what the National Theatre and Met Opera have been doing for the last few years. It's a way to expand the capacity, which will be especially important if capacities are reduced and also consumer spending power is diminished. But, and I think this is the key point, if we're going to make it work, we need to quickly prioritize skills in our organization for capturing performance on screen. And we desperately need more innovation in how we do this. I've spent the last 5 years going to conferences where people have told me that arts and cultural organizations are competing with Netflix, and now it's actually true. So all of these practical considerations aside, at some point we will move into a recovery phase, and it will happen, but we don't know how quickly it's going to happen. I think the critical thing here is that there'll be a blurring of lines when this recovery happens. Not everyone is going to open everything straight away. Consumer confidence will not return immediately and will be highly dependent on how, as a live performance and live event sector, we handle this crisis. It's also going to be dependent on how individually we navigate consumer concerns around safety and also issues like refunds. I think this is borne out by the early findings of Indigo's after the interval survey that Katie Rains presented in her TPC webinar last week, where with around 3/4 of customers wanting some reassurance that they would be able to exchange or get credits for their tickets if they were unwell and unable to attend. The recovery also depend on consumer spending power. So maybe our business model has to change to find ways to provide more access points across ticket pricing, or to support a live event model with a continued digital distribution aspect. In other words, some of the business and operational changes we have to make to cope with phase 2 will persist into the recovery phase, even if the core business model of getting people into the same place at the same time to experience a live event does come back. So it's worth considering how we make some of those decisions effectively and with an eye to long-term recovery. So digital technology and communication is going to be more important than ever, and we've got to be especially savvy in how we use more of our limited resources, which means we need good decision-making around the digital investments our organizations make. And now I think it's time for another poll. Drew?
Look at that. You can see my awful spelling now. I just realized it as well. So the question is, how confident are you in your organization's capability to make good decisions about digital projects and technology? Very confident, mostly confident, a little longfident, which is obviously confident, and not confident at all. So very, mostly, or a little confidence, or none at all. And over half of you have voted now, so we'll close off at 70-odd%, which has just gone past now. And that's end it there and share. So that's very confident, 14%, mostly 37%, a little 42%, not at all 7%. James, okay. Back to you.
Great. So about 50-50 between people who are not a lot or a little and 50% who are mostly or quite a bit. So this is part of a webinar that I've salvaged from my preparation in the heady days of January 2020. And I want to start off with an eye roll slide, but we're on webinar. I can't see you, so I just want you to bear with me as I start from some first principles about digital strategy. And those first principles are, I actually think strategy, or the articulation of strategy, is pretty simple, and same is true as of digital strategy. Really, if you want to communicate it to someone else, you just need to outline the what and the how. But there is, of course, a catch, which is doing good strategy is really hard. Choosing what to do and why you're doing it is at least a whole separate webinar. What I really want to do today is focus on this how side of the equation, because the how is really about investment decisions. You make things happen in organizations by investing time, money, or other resources into making things happen. The other reason strategy is hard is that good strategy requires a feedback loop between the what and the how. Assessing the feasibility and potential of investment decisions means that the what can be refined and improved. We know that the what is often decided by people with lofty sounding job titles, and that reasonably these people aren't going to understand all of the detail that goes into the how across 100% of the totality of their organization. So as a digital specialist, or someone who spends most of their time working with digital technology, having the credibility and authority to question and refine the what because of your understanding of the how is really critical. And the reason that the expertise is important in the digital sphere is because investing in digital strategy is different from other types of strategic investment, for one key economic reason, which is that the marginal cost of digital investments tends to zero over time. This means that over time, the cost of servicing one additional user or customer will go down and eventually get closer and closer to zero. This feels kind of inherently true, and it feels like it reflects our lived experience. It's cheaper to send an email than it is to print something off and send it in the mail. It has a big implication on how consumers value digital things, but it also has big implications on how we make digital investment decisions. It often means that digital is seen as cheap, or that regular investment rules don't apply. But just because the marginal cost is zero doesn't mean that the absolute cost is zero. Regular investment rules do apply, they're just a bit different. And but the misinterpretation leads to bad investment decisions when it comes to digital strategy and technology. In actual fact, the absolute cost of most digital investment is pretty high. The main cost driver of digital investment is people. And if you want to create new digital technology or products from scratch, you need highly specialized teams working together for a significant period of time. These people are in high demand, they command significant salaries, you have to train them, keep them motivated and manage them. Even a small team of 3 or 4 people will cost you 6 figures annually, and even straightforward digital projects will require more person hours than you think to deliver and then support. So the absolute cost can be very high. So instead, we think about buying what we need from someone who has already made that upfront investment. Most of us don't create ticketing systems from scratch. Most of us don't want to build a development team to create a video streaming platform. As a sector, we're lucky that we have some excellent innovators of digital technology who also understand the idiosyncratic needs of live event businesses. I needed a logo grid for this slide, so I stole one from the Ticketing Professionals website. I know not all of these are technology providers, but most of them are. If you have a digital challenge that's not met by a specialist, and sometimes even if you do, there's a good chance that the digital platform or product you buy into isn't going to meet 100% of your needs. That's a trade-off, and being able to manage these trade-offs is essential for good digital strategy. As a result, many people look for a different way that doesn't involve building and allows bought platforms to be extended without significant coding investment, and there's an increasing number of these options available. Depending on how you define it, I think there's broadly 3 categories of these at the moment. You can leverage core platform APIs and commission integrations or extensions of functionality without building that core platform yourself. If you're talking about a web application, you can use plugins deployed via JavaScript to easily add new features. And these can be done without a web developer and often via Google Tag Manager. Ones I've come across recently include Google Optimize for on-page optimization and A/B testing, and Help Scout for on-page chat widgets. Finally, there's an increasing suite of no-code, low-code solutions. Maybe you can't use Squarespace to build your organization's new website, although it could be a great platform for a microsite if you need it. But if you need to prototype or pilot a new project, integration services like Zapier or No or low-code app development platforms like Adalo or Bubble can be a great way to do this. All of these approaches, though, require some digital expertise to get right. You need a technical-ish human to understand the user experience objectives, the technology requirements, the security implications, and other things in order to pull these different dimensions together. But this person doesn't have to be a developer, and chances are you already have someone like this in your organization already. In practice, a complex business's digital investments will be a mixture of built technology, bought technology, and some that falls in between the two. If you understand these options and you have the capability to interpret them at a senior strategic level, I guarantee you will make better digital decisions. Digital investment's also different because the external environment is in kind of constant flux. We're all familiar with the challenge of digital projects where we feel like we're trying to hit a moving target where both the business and technological context is changing all the time. There's an interesting academic paper on this from about 10 years ago. It introduces the concept of digital ecodynamics, the idea that decisions about digital investments need to be a triangulation of external circumstances, the ever-changing capabilities of digital technology, and the IT systems that are already in place. The authors of the paper talk about Apple's iPod launch as one example of the confluence of these factors, taking advantage of a rise in digital music, the capabilities in storage and internet bandwidth, and Apple's existing strength in hardware development. Another example in the paper, which feels especially resonant today, is Cisco's acquisition of WebEx in 2007, just before the financial crisis prompted a decline in business travel and other related costs. It was successful at the time, not just because it happened to fulfill a more urgent need, but also because Cisco had expertise in existing systems that allowed easier integration into corporate networks. The point is that successful investment decisions were made by balancing these various dynamics, some of which required deep expertise in the technology and all of which required a technologist's way of thinking. And Andrew, I think there's a final poll.
Okay, so final one, and the question is, do you have someone on your leadership team who is mostly or wholly focused on digital strategy? Yes, no, or not applicable. And they come rattling in, the votes. 65, 70%. We'll shut it off after 80 is reached. And there we go. And the results for that one are yes, 27%, no, 71, not applicable. 2.
Right. So everything I've said so far will seem obvious to anyone who has experience and expertise working with digital technology. Digital specialists understand cost dynamics and the changing technological landscape better than anyone. But going back to the basics of strategy that I outlined, if your organization isn't able to adjust the what of its strategy to take account of the constraints and the opportunities of the how, then you're going to make bad investments. The key thing I want you to take away from this is to find one or more of these technical humans who understands these dynamics and make them part of your decision-making team, not just to implement the decisions made by the CEO or artistic director or other senior leaders, but to help refine what those decisions are. And yes, also to coordinate the changes to successfully move to a digital world where we need different skills to make our events available online. There are other reasons why having a digital leader will put your organization in good stead for making good investment decisions. This isn't a webinar about Agile methodology, and I'm sure some of us have sat through enough of those. At its core, and in a gross oversimplification, the Agile approach is that it's better to try something, test it, learn and adapt than to set a course at the beginning and hold it unflinchingly. And a good digital leader will think Agile first. They'll bring the skills and experience and expertise to work out how to, rather than committing a 5 or 6 figure budget to solving a digital problem, to instead think of ways of testing concepts and refining them before moving to a full investment position. This is going to be especially important in this age of coronavirus, when the external environment is going to change rapidly and continuously over the coming years. Doing more with less seemed to be the refrain of the 2010s, especially if you were an arts and cultural organisation here in the UK. And this is going to come back tenfold as this coronavirus crunch continues. So we need to make return on investment an essential part of our decision-making process when it comes to digital investments. Again, a digital leader will help refine your thinking around this. I'm sure this is old material for a lot of people listening in, but concentrating on return on investment is a vital tool for refining the what and the how of your digital strategy as we come out of this crisis. It forces us to make decisions, to hone down the scope of digital projects, and to focus on the parts that are going to have the most noticeable effects on our revenue streams, and to push back on other areas that are seen as nice to haves, but not critical in our coronavirus world. Finally, how many of us have gotten almost to the end of a big digital project only to find out there's one huge hurdle that's stopping us from getting over the line? The worst type of final hurdle is one that the organization is self-inflicting on itself by not being able to change business processes or communications, and as a result, preventing the realization of the benefits of the project. Things don't have to be perfect. In fact, most gains don't come from perfect. In the sort of variation of the 80-20 rule, 80% of the gains come from 20% of the effort. You're better to launch and start the process of testing than to be paralyzed by the final hurdle. The mark of effective organizations is whether they're capable of making these decisions and bringing everyone into line behind them in order to realize the gains their digital strategy will bring. And that got me thinking, if I was to summarize all of the things that effective organizations do with regards to their digital strategy, I'd put them in a table like this. Effective organizations involve digital teams as business partners, and as an extension to that, they have digital leaders who have credibility and authority throughout the organization. This is really the key factor, because if you don't have this, it becomes so much harder to do everything else on this list. Effective organizations also know whether they're building, buying, or adapting technology because they know the relative benefits of each of these. They can navigate change really well in order to hit a moving target and not sort of deliver on last month or last year's objective. They work in a semi-agile or agile way, testing and refining as they go, rather than taking an all or nothing approach to project decisions. They are considering potential return on investment at every point in the decision-making process. And finally, they can make decisions about strategic trade-offs in order to move forward with what they want to do. There's a theme of questions at conferences which goes along the lines of, that's really great what you're saying, but how do I get my boss to do this thing that you're talking about? So in that spirit, I want to make some practical suggestions for how to do that. If you don't have a chief digital officer or an equivalent digital director or similar, but you are the digital guru or technical human in your organization, how do you get your boss to include you in these strategic digital decisions? I obviously don't have any infallible suggestions for this one or a magic wand to wave, but you could try some of these things. Make yourself accessible and known to management and leadership. Can you create a working group for digital strategy and technology? Document the skills that you have and the kinds of decisions you could help to refine. That will probably be broader than you initially think it is. If you do that, it's a good way to seek out similarly skilled people to create a broader base of digitally oriented thinking in the organization. And finally, if you can demonstrate success with localized projects at your departmental level, you'll start to build credibility and be called upon to inform these decisions even more. The main things I want to get across are, if you're a CEO, you need a digital leader to help you forge your strategy in this new world we find ourselves in. And that people who understand both the digital landscape and the business of live events are incredibly valuable. If you're a digital specialist in a live events business, what you do is incredibly valuable, and you might not have realized how important or unique your perspective is. If none of this works, you can point people in my direction, and I'll do my best to convince them. Before I finish up, I want to take a quick dip into some economics and add a few thoughts about the idea of investing in a recession. Again, I'm using the word investment in its kind of broadest possible sense here, really, as a catch-all for how we choose to spend our time, our money, or other resources in order to implement our strategy. And what I really want to focus on is how you can take advantage of some of the behavioral trends that happen during these difficult times in order to kind of promote your digital strategy more effectively. As I mentioned earlier, it's likely that we're going to be in difficult financial situation for a long time, until demand in the wider economy starts to return to normal. I think that all of the things I've already talked about will help refine thinking and improve the quality of investment decisions when it comes to digital strategy. And that's going to be even more important during and after this coronavirus period. But there are two other economic dynamics that apply to all kinds of business investments, although in different ways, they both affect digital strategy too. The first is that if there's a direct link between your investments and your market share, there's a lot of evidence to suggest that maintaining or increasing that investment is going to pay off in the short and medium term. Many digital investments have a direct impact on share of market, including digital advertising and digital distribution platforms. For good reason, there's not much data about digital investment during recessions, but there is a good amount of information about another form of share of market investment, which is advertising. And in this synthesis study published about 10 years ago, which covered recessions from the 1920s to the 1990s, the study found that firms that maintained or increased their advertising spend throughout those recessions outperformed firms that did cut, even when advertising spend was resumed after the recession. In other words, the impact lasted several years after the recession was finished. And the reason for this is a behavioral one. Because in a recession, most businesses will reduce spend like advertising and essentially retreat from the market. So if your investment is directly tied or indirectly tied to that share of market, during a recession, you can gain a greater share by maintaining the spending, or you can even make bigger than usual gains by increasing the spending. As a really simple sort of logical example, if we say that there's £100 of annual marketing spend and you have a one-to-one correlation to market share, although obviously in the real world there'd be lots of other factors impacting on this as well. If everyone else in the market cuts their investment by 25%, but you keep yours at a standstill, your share of market will increase by almost 25% without doing anything, without making any additional investment. If you increase your investment by 20%, you'll get a much bigger return than the 20% extra market share, in this case getting a 40% increase versus the baseline. This behavioral effect in a recession opens up the opportunity for significant market share if you have the right combination of resources to invest to exploit that opportunity. Surely no one's going to be kind of rolling in cash and able to spend as much as they would have done before. But if you're looking at where you spend your time in an organization, maintaining the time you spend in keeping a share of market or increasing that share of market could be a good way to invest that time in the organization. The other dimension that takes place during a recession is the idea that prices get depressed over time. So there's not much data from digital investments, but there is quite a lot of data that we can look at from the construction sector, including these indices from Faith and Gould from the global financial crisis. And this again, behavioral impact that most people are going to retreat from the market, and therefore there's going to be value for money for people who do have resources to invest. I think particularly applies to organizations that have oven-ready plans kind of ready to go if they want to make upfront investments in projects or digital platforms. I know that there's a few talks coming up in the next few weeks in the TPC webinar series about getting projects going during this time. And I expect some of those will continue some of these themes. I hope I haven't depressed you all too much. I do have a few notes and thoughts to go through in summary, just taking a moment to reflect on how this session could have looked. In fact, it looks a lot like it does look because I'm speaking to an empty room in this photo. The world is going to look very different for some time, but the new normal isn't the end, and there will be a recovery. Because of the nature of the crisis and the advantages that digital technology brings, being able to engage with people remotely and be able to coordinate and activities and interactions from a distance, good digital decision-making will absolutely make a difference to the success of businesses during this period, both during the distancing phase and during the recovery phase. But this requires having digital leaders and digital experts around the table contributing to the decision-making process and to the investment decision process, not just being tasked to implement decisions that have been made by someone else. And that's because digital leaders know how to balance building versus buying versus adapting, and they have the skills to do as much as possible with the resources that are available. It will lead to a more agile process, which can be refined over time, and also starts to create results faster. It will lead to better return on investments. And even if you don't have the money, even if you don't have money to invest, the time of your team is still a resource that should derive a return to the business. And finally, having a digital leader will help you navigate the trade-offs between what you've always done and how you can work better in the future. Thank you very much. Do reach out to me if you have any questions. I've all but given up Twitter since the beginning of lockdown, and I'm feeling much happier as a result of doing that. But if anyone wants to reach out by email, feel free. I'm also, during this time of coronavirus chaos, running free digital consultations, which you can sign up to via the Made Media website at this address. There's no obligation for buying anything, and I won't try and sell you anything. The sessions I've had so far have been akin to digital counselling and have been interesting for me, as well as hopefully useful for the people signing up. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, James. We've got some questions coming in on the Q&A, and already some with some thumbs up as well. So we'll just let those develop a little bit. So head down or up, depending on where your toolbar is, and get a question in for James. I've got one here, which is really, I saw your presentation yesterday, and I was really thinking about this idea of being in recession and investment. And I've had a lot of chats with MDs and CEOs of tech companies now who are not desperate to sell their stuff or their services, but really willing to cut a deal, for better word. So do you think we're in now a buyer's market? If I was going to change out my CRM or my website or my app or whatever else I do?
I certainly think there'll be opportunities for that, yes, and I'm already starting to see that a little bit as well. That might not necessarily translate directly into cheaper prices on paper, although it might do, but it also might relate to more flexibility over timing, or getting more bang for your buck in terms of what you are buying. So I think we're definitely going to start to see more of that, because actually we've seen it already a little bit.
Okay, so we've got two people at the top with questions with 17 thumbs up, but we've got this habit now of ignoring those first and going to who's the one beneath it. So Robert Sampson asks, with the adjustments in our venues, how do you see pricing adjusting for the product? So this idea of now 20 or 30% of seats available, how do we think the prices are going to adjust?
I think you're probably there's I guess a few parts to the answer to that question. One is that I think we've got to be mindful of the fact that people's capacity to pay is definitely going to be impacted as we go through this. So I think we're definitely going to have to maintain or even increase the amount of sort of accessible ticket prices to make the product available to people who just have less disposable income. There will continue to be people for whom that is not an issue, and I suspect you will also see an increase in the top pricing of tickets as well. In my mind, I'm thinking of a sort of classic commercial venue, maybe West End, just to give you an idea of sort of how I'm thinking about this answer. So I think probably you're going to see a sort of stretching of ticket prices, if you like. The other dimension, and something that occurred to me yesterday, is we're going to see a even bigger dynamic of looking at dynamic pricing and people varying pricing as they go along, because people just aren't going to have the information they need to accurately price their house when they put their events on sale, because actually they don't know what their physical capacity might be by the time the show comes around. So I think you're going to see more variability. I think you're going to see a greater range of ticket pricing, and that's going to be a communications challenge, digitally and not, to sort of to show that how those ticket prices kind of fall across a house, and that they're subject to change and could vary as situations evolve. So if we can get the communication piece right, I think you're going to see a lot more variability in those ticket prices going forward.
Excellent. Which actually is a nice kind of segue into advertising 2 upcoming sessions, which is Ashman from Substract on the new normal and what to do next, which is coming up, I think, in 2 weeks' time. And next week, Baker Richards, Francesca talking about pricing for reopening. So if you haven't seen those two, they're listed on the website now. But thanks, Robert, for that question. Therese Cross asks, what learning/training resources are out there for people who are interested in learning more about digital?
I would definitely point people towards so there's 2 things. I think one, it is very useful to get a grounding in digital platforms that everyone is using. So tools like Google Analytics and Facebook and other platforms, and all of those big providers have online training courses, and you can do accreditations, and it doesn't take that long, but it gives you a real grounding in user behavior, particularly all the Google Analytics ones. Actually, it's a bit broader than just understanding how you use that platform. And then beyond that, I mean, there's everything from paid for courses, but there's tons on platforms like Udemy and similar that are worth looking at as well. I mean, in terms of getting some of these dynamics, it's worth saying that, like, a lot of these things, if you're in the world day to day and you're looking at things that are going to provoke thinking about this, looking at blogs like the one that's coming to mind that I go to quite a bit or keep an eye on quite a lot is the Stratechery blog, which I'll try and remember and post about, which talks a lot about these kinds of economic and questions as they relate to digital technology.
Thank you for that. I actually, at the start of lockdown, I started watching YouTube videos, just 3 or 4 minute YouTube videos, just to up my knowledge or to give me that base of whether I actually wanted to learn more about it. And just to follow up, Laura Hutchinson says to Therese's question, Google Digital Garage do a good free one on digital fundamentals that covers everything from beginner level. So thanks for that. Anonymous, not the hacking group, Anonymous attendee, asks, any suggestions on how to upskill members of a marketing or communications team who may have little or no digital experience? James.
So again, there's 2 parts to this. There's broader digital skills. In a sense, I actually think for that sort of team, the challenge is really about how you change and think about the way that you are producing content. And that doesn't require technical information necessarily about how the digital platforms work, but does involve sort of a more creative approach to looking at and creating digital content. And for this, I think this is kind of underdeveloped, and I'd like to see it become more developed over the coming months. Like, there are plenty of artists, plenty of contemporary artists who are working kind of in a sort of digital live performance space, and I think actually looking more towards that kind of practice and seeing actually how can we create content that's engaging online, that kind of works in that space, is almost the bigger challenge. And I would say it needs to involve a team that's broader than the marketing communications team. It needs to involve, particularly if you're in an artist organization, and I realize not everyone on this webinar will be, like, what other contacts and threads can you bring in to have ideas about how to expand the way that you produce content online, because I think at the moment that's our biggest challenge. Is so much of what has been produced before lockdown can feel very staid in a pure digital form, and if we're moving to some sort of hybrid model, at least in the short to medium term, we're going to have to up our game on how that content's produced.
Brilliant. This is a great one now from Rachel, and she asked, many people are saying we should charge for our digital content and stop giving it away for free. Do you agree? there is so much free digital content out there at the moment. Competing feels difficult for a rural regional venue, and this is an interesting one, because we're doing these webinars, and we've just, while we've been on doing this one, we passed 3,000 registration, which is fantastic. But two people had to be on different calls today. Imagine if you charged £5 for each one of them. And it's bizarre, because it's naturally, we're flipping into this idea of trying to monetize something. So James, we should charge for digital and not give it away for free. Do you agree?
It depends. So I mean, it's all about value, right? And I'd be interested to hear if Baker Richards' webinar gets into this next week. But the idea that you're trying to place a value on the digital content is a tricky one to navigate, because I think at the moment I've seen lots of conversations back and forth about whether people should be charging right now. To some extent, I feel like that's a bit of a parlor game. Like some people, if they feel like they can charge for some of their content, and people are going to pay, that's great. If that isn't possible right at this moment in time, I don't think that's the main issue. Certainly the market isn't going to bear every single arts and cultural organisation around the world suddenly flooding online and YouTube and other platforms with lots of paid for digital content. Like, the market just won't be there for that. Particularly, as I say, if the content isn't innovative enough or suited enough to the digital sphere. But it will absolutely be a way to expand capacity for live events. So if you've got shows that have hit capacity, particularly if that's a reduced capacity, if you want to try and reach broader audiences beyond people who just can attend the venue for kind of geographical reasons, then digital distribution is absolutely going to help with that. And I would absolutely charge for that. And you can find a price point that suits that, but you've got to ask what the value that someone is deriving from that content. And I suspect that the content that's going to be derived from lots of archival footage at the moment is probably pretty low, unless you're making a really compelling case for purchase. But tied to a live event scenario, I think the case for purchase could be much higher. So it's just about balancing those dimensions of cost and value.
Okay. Thank you very much for that. Now, we have 8 questions to go, 8 minutes from our allotted time, so we're going to have to try and rattle through some of these. I want to just go to the bottom of the pile, right at the bottom, because Sarah Solomon's asked a question here, which I think is really relevant to a lot of people, which is, our problem is that we don't have any digital recordings we can use, which, again, we hear a lot of the time that, the large organizations have things, but I don't think that's got to be a barrier. Have you seen anyone doing anything apart from webinars or other things? What content that people have produced fresh and live now, rather than having it kind of on a reel on a shelf somewhere?
Yeah, I mean, again, I think it depends what purpose the content is serving. I mean, if you're talking about delivering your product, if you're an organization that produces plays or orchestral performances, and you're talking about your product being that performance, like pivoting to be able to produce that online or distribute it online, obviously you either need the recordings or you need some way of creating the new recordings. If actually what you're talking about is either in content, from a marketing perspective to continue engagement through this period, or to meet some of your other objectives in terms of community engagement or educational engagement, etc. I mean, there's been, there's lots of content around short content pieces, some of which work really well. I saw, I'm going to misremember the name of the orchestra, which is going to be embarrassing, but there was an orchestra, US orchestra, that produced one of their members, their musicians, produced a video where they were playing multiple parts, and they sort of re-recorded it over Zoom. Again, the name of the orchestra is evading me. Maybe someone could post it in the Q&A if they know what I'm talking about. But it was really engaging content, or it made me laugh. But that was very much for sort of marketing, engagement, philanthropical, fundraising content that was being put out there. So that kind of stuff can be produced and could be produced in quite innovative ways. If you don't have the archival recording and your product is quite precious, I suppose, in terms of the way that you're creating it, then it's going to be very hard to do that without historical recordings. But we need to think about how we're going to do it when we can start letting some people back in the building.
Excellent. Yeah, so Sarah also follows up this. They're doing sing-alongs and chair dancing because they're producing theatre. I've spoken to a music centre this week that's doing outreach work to care homes as well, trying to do those as well. Staying at the bottom of the pile, Ahmed, hello, regular attendee. He's making the point, I'm going to summarise it very quickly, about socially distanced seating plans being difficult, especially on mobile devices when we're blocking out seats. And he's looking for any ideas about how you can do that to make it kind of more user-friendly. And I'll just answer that one very quickly, Ahmed. I think if you look at the vendors' websites, there's a lot of different takes on it. Monad Ticketing doing some interesting stuff, Seats.io, tickets.com as well have all kind of surged ahead in these areas of these auto seat distance. I know they're not systems you use, but social distance seating plans. So I'd say on that one, have a look at the vendor websites. James, have you got anything to add on that?
Just reiterate what I said before, which is just think really carefully if you want to open up with reserved seating, because I think there's going to be a lot of operational challenges, not just in selling the ticket, but actually getting people to the seat, and that some form of general admission, best available type seating within zones potentially might be easier to manage operationally, at least to begin with.
Yeah, I had a friend from Norway tell me he went to the cinema because they've opened that up. And as you get there, the number in your group is then assigned a zone, and they seat depending on the numbers of the size of different groups made up. So thanks for that one, Ahmed. We've got a couple more to go. Anonymous, how do we marry digital agile thinking and an iteration with the performing arts, which inevitably think in waterfall fashion, i.e. always pushing towards opening night? How do you marry those two up, James?
This is a good question. I suppose that's a nice encapsulation of what I seem to spend most of my time doing. So I think that Agile isn't an absolute, and actually neither is waterfall in practice, this idea that you're always heading towards one thing, because events are always going to happen, as we're seeing right now. But if you can move the bias towards that agile way of thinking, you can you have certain objectives in mind as you're going through the process, and by kind of breaking things down into smaller steps, you can sort of still head towards your overall objective, which absolutely you need to do. And we're doing all of the time, speaking from a perspective of a supplier to the industry. Like we're given deadlines all the time by clients, and because they've got events to go on sale or campaigns to launch, and so you meet them. But with an agile approach, you might choose to deprioritize things as you get closer to the launch date, or in fact bring more things into the scope if you're getting closer to the launch date, and you can accomplish more. So it's about having a sense of priorities, and you can work towards dates with an agile methodology, but it involves you being really clear on what those priorities are.
Okay, thanks for that. I'm going to go down to the bottom again because it's an interesting one that's come in from Stefano. And he asks, how do you prevent uncontrolled digital distribution? It's pretty easy to download a video from YouTube to watch when it's no longer available online. Who controls it if there's further distribution?
So it's really important. And actually, the other piece that I didn't add into the conversation around streaming was that, the whole question about rights. And again, there's probably a whole webinar on live performance organizations figuring out digital distribution rights. And so, yes, controlling content is incredibly important. YouTube does have some controls over this. I'm seeing a lot of, so the work that we're doing often uses platforms like Brightcove or Vimeo to a greater or lesser extent that have much greater controls over how that content can be distributed and locked down to specific domains, for example. And more akin to the challenges of trying to rip something from Netflix than they are to ripping something from YouTube. Not to say that there aren't risks in putting content out there online. I think that's always going to be the case, and always has been the case since the beginning of the internet. But certainly, these a good sort of good video distribution platform will help you solve many of these problems.
Okay, thank you, Stefano, for that one. Couple of comments rather than anything else. Anonymous, the social distancing of backstage and onstage areas needs to be considered and not be a dilemma. Yeah, completely agree with that one. I think we're all talking about it's everywhere, not just in the audience. 3 to go. Let's pick, we might as well go at the top of the list. Any tips on managing competing demands from across the organization that, quote, digital is the answer to everything? How do we keep an audience focused to help inform decisions? And I'll add to that one, the other one that's on here, which is how can I encourage the wider team to think of digital as being relevant to all of us and not just marketing? So those two are kind of almost conflicting, but thinking about that global buy-in.
Yeah. So if you're a CEO on this call and I'm talking to you, then I would say it comes back to this idea of thinking very seriously about getting someone that is empowered to drive digital strategy across the organization, because that person's role is to think holistically across all uses, not just marketing uses, but is also empowered to be part of the conversations around what's actually being created and how's it being created, and thinking at the point of programming about how it's going to get captured digitally now going forward. So if you're in that position, then that's for you. If you're not in that position, I think it comes back to some of the things I was saying about looking at working groups, trying to document good practice, sharing some of the skills that are in the organization, and working more broadly across them. But I think that idea that something gets programmed and then once the run opens, you might, or just as the run is about to start, you think, oh, how are we going to record this so that we have archive footage, or we can put it online or sell it or something? Like, if that was part of the decision-making process when the thing was commissioned, you'd be having very different conversations about it.
Okay, thank you very much. And in the middle of that one was another one which was talking about siloed organizations, and that they're going to perform badly in digital strategy when there's a silo between creative and admin and everyone else. So I think you can kind of answer that one as well. So thank you very much, James. We've managed to get through it 1 minute over. So thank you very much for your time today. And it's a nice segue into lots of things we've talked about, into what's coming up. So tomorrow, double header, 2 o'clock, Jamie Snellgrove from Theatre Tokens. It may seem a boring subject to some people except for Jamie, but there's a lot of money out there for entertainment and experiences that are tied up in Theatre Tokens. So it's really interesting maybe to swing by and have a listen to what he has to say. And then tomorrow, our first kind of double header of presenters, Kate and Erin from Tessitura, talking about reducing membership churn as renewals occur. We're at risk of losing members as they come up for renewal and we're still closed. So they're doing a session tomorrow afternoon. That's 4 p.m. Before we head up to Thursday and Friday with Lucy and Bruce. So once again, James, thank you very much indeed for putting this together. Sorry we couldn't have it at TPC 2020, but thank you very much for coming this afternoon.
Thanks, Andrew.
And James will be sending out, to those of you who opted in to hear from him, he'll be sending out some details, possibly of slides and contact details, etc. The rest will be on Maid's Twitter account. All that remains is for you to say thank you very much for joining us this afternoon, and we hope to see you again soon.